Hello. Hi, Teresa. How you doing? Hi, Dolores. Kay. Nice to see you on YouTube, Devora. Steve Day says, hey, hey. Teresa sent us some error on YT. It said, hello, everyone. Steve Wolfbrand said, hello, everyone. It's shared. Some error on YT, it said. Huh. Anyway, glad you're here. Thanks for coming. Kay, I see you found it okay today. That's good. Okay, so the war of the establishment against the progressives. Gardening, huh? Okay. Yeah, the establishment's been fighting a war against us for a long time, I think. But they're still at it. So let's start by sharing something that may seem far removed from that, but it's really not. Specifically, an article from The Guardian. New Zealand not willing to risk UK style, quote, live with COVID policy, says Jacinda Ardern. There's a picture of Jacinda. Let's see what she has to say. God bless you, honey.
So different countries, different choices. At the moment, I'd say our thinking has been, let's continue on a path that preserves as many options for New Zealand as possible, particularly as we see variants emerging. Variants do pose a new risk. We have to keep seeing what effect variants have on vaccination programs. So New Zealand has always been in the position, thankfully, we've been able to make the decisions we have and pick the path that we travel down, having watched and seen what other countries have done often first. That has proved to be of real benefit to New Zealand. So we will continue to watch and observe.
Would you ever accept having a bit of COVID in the country, but even if we get a high vaccination rate, but there was still going to be some people who are, for whatever reason, not vaccinated?
As we consider these issues and these options, priority for me is how do we continue to preserve what New Zealand has managed to gain and give ourselves options, because this virus is not done with the world yet. And if we preserve our options, that enables us to make choices that are good for our economy and good for our health. But, of course, what we also want to see is a bit more movement at our border. And I think there are ways we can safely do both.
And that's it. That's what she had to say. So, the article was by Tess McClure in Christchurch. New Zealand has dismissed suggestions it should follow in Britain's footsteps to live with COVID-19, saying the level of death which is proposed by Boris Johnson would be unacceptable. I happened to watch John Campbell's program today, and what John Campbell had to say is that they're anticipating that COVID cases are going to explode in Britain because of the Delta variant. Boris Johnson is lifting regulations because he thinks it's time to just live with COVID. According to Campbell, what's going on is that they believe the Delta variant is going to mix with the vaccines in such a way that it will not give people high protection against the vaccine. So, for example, it's going to cut down the efficacy of the vaccine in terms of its ability to stop you from catching COVID from 94% to something like 63%. So a lot more people are going to catch COVID. But the same vaccines are giving people a sufficient amount of protection that they're unlikely to get a serious case or go into the hospital, and the vaccines are 94% effective in that respect. So it's kind of expected that a lot of people, perhaps COVID cases would even reach 50,000 a day in the UK. And so a lot of people out of that 50,000, maybe 6% or something like that, are going to be catching COVID. However, it's going to be a mild version, something like the sniffles, something like a sore throat, something like a common cold. And the thinking is, each time they catch COVID that way, it's going to serve as a booster shot. It's going to be just like a booster shot. So it's going to lift their immunity again and again and again. And this is going to happen across the whole population. Okay, in the UK, that's the thinking anyway. And so what they're doing is they're saying we're going to be like Sweden, and this is going to be a herd immunity strategy. So New Zealand is saying that's not something we've been willing to accept in but New Zealand. No, she and they have not been willing to accept it there. How many deaths do they have? Well, they've got 5 million people there, okay, in New Zealand, and they've had 26 deaths since COVID had started, which is 5 and a little fraction deaths per million. That's what they have had there. That is roaring success. Compared to the UK is, last time I looked, close to 1,900 fatalities per million. 5 versus 1,900. Which would you like? Well, Jacinda Ardern is saying, one of the things the UK government have been very clear about is there will be spike in cases, potentially thousands of cases a day. There will be more people dying. We're likely to see more incremental change than dramatic change when we wake up one morning and say, quote, we just go back to the way things were before COVID-19. Well, Ardern asked whether the country would accept deaths from COVID. And she said, quote, different countries are taking different choices. Quote, the priority for me is how do we continue to preserve what New Zealand has managed to gain and give ourselves options. Virus is not done with the world yet, unquote. Director General of Health in New Zealand, Ashley Bloomfield, said on Wednesday that New Zealand would be watching closely, quote unquote, and could place the UK on a no-fly list if cases grew out of control. Quote, if they do get an increase in cases, we will be keeping a close eye on what that means for the risk of people traveling from the UK. That will inform our decisions here. Asked if that could result in suspending flights, as New Zealand did with India in April, he said, quote, we actually review the risk status of all countries each week. So clearly, if there is an increase in the number of cases, that's one of the things we'll be watching very closely. Epidemiologist and public health professor Michael Baker said New Zealand's future roadmap could be built on a mixture of high vaccination and other measures such as mask mandates or limited lockdowns to contain outbreaks. He said the country was in a, quote, privileged position, unquote, where it could make an informed choice about whether to continue with an elimination approach or change tack. Quote, by every metric, New Zealand's elimination approach is outperforming the alternatives. From a public health point of view, from an equity point of view, from a freedoms point of view, from an economic point of view. Australia's COVID current response is still very closely aligned with New Zealand's in practice. But Prime Minister Scott Morrison's rhetoric has recently shifted somewhat towards Johnson's. Last week, Scott Morrison outlined a 4-phase Australian reopening roadmap, saying that by phase 3, COVID would be treated like the flu or any other infectious disease, unquote. Baker said public health professionals were, quote, disturbed, unquote, by the UK's return to allowing COVID to circulate unchecked, and that the phrase, quote, living with it, unquote, was a, quote, meaningless slogan that failed to communicate the consequences of millions of infections or the alternative options for managing the virus. We often absorb a lot of our rhetoric from Europe and North America, which have really managed the pandemic very badly. I don't think we should necessarily follow or accept Boris Johnson and company saying, quote, oh, we have to learn to live with the virus. Quote, says Dr. Baker, we always have to be a bit skeptical about learning lessons from countries that have failed very badly. Can you dig that? I can dig it. They're among the best in the world right now in New Zealand. They've made it work. Their people haven't suffered. Their country hasn't suffered. Why should they listen to advice from countries that have had 1,900 fatalities per million to their 5 fatalities per million? They are the best, or very close to the best. These other countries, while not the very worst, since some countries have actually, over the last 2-3 months, there's been total slaughter in those countries. Some of them are up around 5,300 fatalities per million now. So the UK and the US are no longer among the worst in the world. But compared to New Zealand, both of us, both countries, are miserable failures. Even Canada is a miserable failure. But the establishment says that they've been doing pretty well now, right? We know that is not true. And the very progressive Jacinda Ardern knows exactly what to do. What she's been doing all along to save lives, to save the economy, to save their freedoms, to save their healthcare system, to save everything. And she's done it. She's done it. And you got to take your hat off to her, because she has really done it. Yes, the real progressive, democratic socialist prime minister of New Zealand. And here we come. Student debtors. Most student debtors can't make their payments. It's time for debt cancellation. It's been time for debt cancellation for ages. By the way, this is from Truth Out. Nice picture of the White House with a sign in front saying, cancel student debt, right? Cancel student debt. This piece is by Rajko Kolonzik for Truth Out. In recent years, many economists have claimed that canceling student debt is economically regressive in that it would disproportionately favor higher income households. Yet study after study have revealed that this is not the case. In particular, a new study by the Roosevelt Institute, a progressive institute, explains that the, quote, regressive myth rests on a series of misleading methodological foundations, unquote, demonstrating that contrary to these regressive claims, student debt cancellation at each proposed level of cancellation, Biden's $10,000 proposal, Warren and Schumer's $50,000 proposal, or the Institute's own proposal of $75,000, would see those most economically marginalized benefiting the most. The Roosevelt Institute study authors contend that previous assessments depend too heavily on annual household income, which does not fully account for a household's overall assets. Instead, they incorporated student debt distribution by race and household wealth, which is often ignored in studies that show cancellation to be regressive, to demonstrate that canceling student debt is fundamentally progressive, while also taking into account the impact of student debt on the entire population, not just the borrowers themselves. The authors note that this measure more accurately depicts the size of the burden experienced by those in lower income households for whom each dollar of debt is actually a more substantial barrier to economic security, access to consumer credit, and increases in net worth. Furthermore, the authors did not include private debt, since only federal student loans are eligible for cancellation under the present student debt cancellation proposals from Elizabeth Warren and Chuck Schumer, as well as the Biden administration, while valuing student debt by its costs towards the borrowers, not the lenders. Bernie Sanders, on the other hand, included private debt in his proposal. By looking at the share of the wealth, not just student debt in absolute numbers, it becomes clear that borrowers in the lower percentiles are much more burdened than their counterparts in the higher percentiles. In other words, student debt makes up a larger share of their annual household incomes or share of household wealth compared to higher percentile households, which makes repayment difficult and almost impossible. This is precisely why the study finds that the greatest benefits of student debt cancellation accumulate to those in the bottom 40 percentile for all racial groups. Moreover, by examining the distribution of student debt by wealth and race instead of the standard income variable, cancellation provides ample evidence that the racial wealth gap would narrow in the process. Do you hear that, Joe Biden? The study's authors note that black borrowers, in fact, would benefit significantly white borrowers at every point on the income and asset distribution continuum, reflecting the fact that black borrowers must borrow more for expenses than white students of equivalent income levels due to the racial wealth gap in family resources. For instance, black borrowers in the poorest 10% of household wealth would receive around $17,000, where white borrowers in the same percentile would receive approximately $12,000 under the Warren-Schumer plan. Meanwhile, the wealthiest households across all race groups would benefit from debt forgiveness by an average of $562. So they hardly benefit at all. It is critical to emphasize the significance of this study. It is another in a long series of studies that have provided evidence that student debt cancellation is progressive from an economic point of view. A prominent scholar on the subject, Marshall Steinbaum of the University of Utah, showed that the Warren-Schumer plan would see the lowest earners who owe more than their annual income in student debt owe just 1/5 of their annual income. According to a Brandeis University analysis, 76% of student loan holders would have their debt canceled with Warren's $50,000 proposal. We have very good reason to believe that canceling student debt provides significant economic benefits that stimulate the economy too. Previous research showed that is, of course, the Levy Institute study, which Marshall Steinbaum was a co-author of us, as was Scott Fullwiler, Stephanie Kelton, and I believe Pavlina Chernyeva, but I'm not sure, that canceling all student debt creates over 1 million jobs per year while increasing GDP by up to $108 billion. Over 10 years, cancellation generates between $861 billion and $1.083 trillion in real GDP in 2016 dollars. Freed from the heavy burden of student debt, students would use the extra money for day-to-day living expenses and pay off other obligations. As student debt remains in place, it's causing significant and unequal harm to marginalized borrowers, which can only be reduced and remedied by cancellation. How about it, Joe Biden? For instance, as shown by a recent report from the Student Borrower Protection Center, students of color disproportionately struggle to pay their student debt at a higher rate than white students, creating a vicious cycle of economic inequality along racial lines. The authors note, quote, America's student debt crisis is a civil rights crisis. Also, on average, black graduates owe $7,400 more than white graduates. 32% of black borrowers and 15% of Latinx borrowers are in, quote, default, unquote, with their payments. In New York, the 6 communities with the greatest level of student loan default are largely non-white and centered in the Bronx, my own hometown, even though they have relatively smaller average loan balances. Moreover, the cost of cancellation is not a straightforward concept, since the total amount of student debt owed by borrowers and the cost of cancellation are not the same thing. As Sparky Abraham argues, lending money is a gamble on the future. If a substantial number of borrowers struggle to pay off their debt or die in debt, forgiving all the debt would cost less than the total amount owed, $1.7 trillion. The only way the federal government loses revenue through cancellation is when all borrowers pay back their debt. That is the direction we are now taking, which implies the federal government is currently collecting payments and hence inevitably losing money on a considerably smaller percentage than commonly assumed. The standard system, get the loan, pay it back in fixed amounts over time, only works for roughly a fourth of the loans. A whopping 75% of student debt is carried by those who are either not paying or are paying a fixed amount based on their annual income because they can't afford their normal payments. This suggests that cancellation would cost substantially less than total owed by borrowers, since the federal government would end up losing revenue due to accruing interest and the inability to pay total balance by the borrowers. But of course, the economic cost of cancellation should not even be the principal deciding factor. Even if student debt forgiveness is somehow shown to be economically regressive, quote unquote, it would be irrelevant. Forgiveness is an ethical matter regardless of cost, quote unquote. The issue at hand is the harm caused to students and its moral implications. By forcing repayment on their student debt, society is dooming its next generation to miserable and suffering lives for essentially nothing other than to increase neoliberalism's assault on the general population. As Noam Chomsky points out, the student debt and not its forgiveness is the truly regressive policy and an unjust imposition. I hope Biden was listening to that one, because he really needs to hear it. He really needs to hear it. The establishment position is student debt, and the progressive position is forgiveness of student debt. And the establishment has been fighting a war on the progressive the position for so many years now. I can hardly count them. Next, a more obvious war on progressives. It's a piece by Norman Solomon. The Empire strikes back at the left in Buffalo and Cleveland on July 1st. The two biggest cities on the shores of Lake Erie are now centers of political upheaval. For decades, Buffalo and Cleveland have suffered from widespread poverty and despair in the midst of urban decay. When I moved to Buffalo after my PhD to take my first job, it was 1965. And Buffalo was already in trouble in 1965. People were trying to boost Buffalo, to bring industry back to Buffalo. That was 56 years ago. It'll be 56 years in September. 56 years, and nothing was done to bring that city back. Today, the second largest cities in New York and Ohio are battlegrounds between activists fighting before progressive change and establishment forces determined to prevent it. For Buffalo's entrenched leaders, a shocking crisis arrived out of the blue on June 22nd when socialist India Walton won the Democratic primary for mayor, handily defeating a 15-year incumbent with a deplorable track record. Quote, "I am a coalition builder," unquote, she said in her victory speech that night. But for the city's power brokers, she was a disaster. Quote, "This is organizing. When we organize, we win. Today is not only the beginning. From the very start, I said this is not about making India Walton mayor of Buffalo. It's about building the infrastructure to challenge every damn seat. I'm talking about committee seats, school board, county council. All that we are doing in this moment is claiming what is rightfully ours. We are the workers. We do the work. And we deserve a government that works with and for us. Unquote. To the people running City Hall, the 38-year-old victor seemed to come out of nowhere. Actually, she had come out of grassroots activism and a campaign that focused on key issues like, quote, food access, unquote, quote, pandemic recovery, unquote, education, climate, housing, and public safety. And for corporate elites accustomed to having their hands on Buffalo's levers of power, there would not be a GOP fallback. Mayor Byron Brown had appeared to be such a shoo-in for a fifth term that no Republican bothered to run. So, India Walton will be the only name on the November ballot. Maybe not so fast, because Byron Brown has been talking about a mail-in campaign. I'm sorry, a write-in campaign. A write-in mail-in campaign, maybe. Anyway, alarm sirens went off immediately after election night. The loudest and most prominent came from wealthy, net worth $150 million real estate developer Carl Palladino, a strident Trump supporter and former Republican nominee for governor, who became notorious in 2016 for racist public comments about the Obamas. Walton's victory incensed Palladino, who made it clear that he vastly preferred the black incumbent to the black challenger. Quote, I will do everything I can to destroy her candidacy, unquote, Palladino said. And he urged fellow business leaders in Buffalo to unite behind Brown as a write-in candidate. Oh, there it is, the write-in candidacy. In tacit alliance with Palladino, while keeping him at arm's length, Brown announced on Monday evening that he will mount a write-in campaign to stay in the mayor's office. Brown cited among his mayoral achievements that the fact that the tax rate in Buffalo is the lowest it's been in 25 years, which is one of the reasons why Buffalo is declining so rapidly. Then he began scaremongering. Quote, I've also heard from voters there is tremendous fear that has spread across this city. People are fearful about the future of our city. They're fearful about the future of their families. They're fearful about the future of their children. They have said to me that they do not want a radical socialist occupying the mayor's office in Buffalo City Hall. You know, we know the difference between democracy. We're going to fight for democracy in the city of Buffalo. The voters have said they don't want an unqualified, inexperienced radical socialist trying to learn on the job on the backs of the residents of this community. We will not let it happen. It will not stand, unquote. Have the voters said that? Seemed to me the voters voted for Walton, didn't they? They voted for Walton. They didn't vote for Brown. They said clearly they want Walton. Such attacks with McCarthyite echoes of Trumpism are likely to be at the core of Brown's strategy for winning the general election. But he'll be in conflict with the formal apparatus of his party in Buffalo. After the write-in campaign announcement, the chair of the Erie County Democratic Party passed an unequivocal statement about India Walton. Quote, to strongly affirm once again that we are with her now and through the general election in the fall. Last Tuesday, India proved she has the message and the means to move and inspire the people of Buffalo It was a historic moment in Western New York politics. The voters heard her message and embraced her vision for the city's future, and we look forward to working with her and her team to cross that final finish line on November 2nd. Isn't that amazing? The party is with her. Of course, it's the local party. 200 miles away in Northeast Ohio, the clash between progressives and corporatists has been escalating for several months. Ever since Marcia Fudge left the congressional seat vacant when she became President Biden's HUD secretary. Early voting begins next week, and the district is so heavily Democratic that the winner of the August 3rd primary is virtually certain to fill the vacancy this fall. Well, next week is now. This article was on July 1st. This is the week when early voting begins. I think it began actually today, but I may be mistaken about that. On Tuesday, the number 3 Democrat in the House, Representative Jim Clyburn, went out of his way to be emphatic that he doesn't want the front runner in the race, progressive stalwart Nina Turner, to become a colleague in Congress, although nominally endorsing Turner's main opponent, Shontel Brown. The clear underlying message was, stop Turner. Clyburn went beyond just making an endorsement. He provided some barbed innuendos via an interview with the New York Times, which reported comments that say something about Clyburn's self-concept, but nothing really about Turner. Quote, what I try to do is demonstrate by precept and example how we ought to proceed as a party. When I spoke out against sloganeering like burn, baby, burn in the 1960s and, quote, defund the police, unquote, which I think it is cutting the throats of the party. I know exactly where my constituents are. They are against that, and I'm against that. His constituents down in South Carolina, yeah, they've lost all hope. And he's the perfect representative for people who have lost all hope. In fact, Democrats are overwhelmingly in favor. How do I know they lost all hope? Because they voted for Biden and not for Sanders. In fact, Democrats are overwhelmingly in favor of programs being championed by Turner. None more notably than Medicare for All, a proposal that Clyburn and many of his big funders have worked so hard to block. Clyburn has vacuumed in more than $1 million from donors in the pharmaceutical industry. And he previously made headlines vilifying Medicare for All during the 2020 presidential primary. The Daily Poster pointed out on Wednesday. The corporate money behind Clyburn is of a piece with the forces arrayed against Turner, when what she calls, quote, the commodification of healthcare is a major reason. In mid-June, Turner launched a television spot entitled Worry, in which he talks about how her family struggled to pay healthcare, led her to support Medicare for All, unquote. The Daily Poster reported, quote, the very next day, corporate lobbyists held a Washington fundraiser for Turner's primary opponent, Shontel Brown. Among those headlining the fundraiser was Jerome Murray, a registered lobbyist for the Pharmaceutical Researchers and Manufacturers Association, which has been backing a nationwide campaign to reduce support for Medicare for All. Whether Clyburn's endorsement will have a significant impact on the voting is hard to say, but it signaled that high-ranking Democrats are more determined than ever to keep Turner out of Congress if they possibly can. His move came 2 weeks after Hillary Clinton endorsed Brown, who has also received endorsements from the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, who is Representative Joyce Beatty, and the chief deputy whip of House Democrats. I'm sorry. She received endorsements from Joyce Beatty of the CBC, chair of the CBC, and the chief deputy whip of the House Democrats, who is Representative Peter Aguilar. On the other hand, a dozen progressive members of the House have endorsed Turner, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ro Khanna, Rashida Tlaib, and Jamal Bowman, as well as Senator Bernie Sanders. Carmen Yulin Cruz, the former mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico, who, like Nina Turner, was a national co-chair of the Sanders 2020 presidential campaign, is a strong supporter of Turner for Congress. This week, summing up the fierce opposition for power brokers who want to prevent a Turner victory, Cruz used words that equally apply to the powerful interests trying to prevent India Walton from becoming the next mayor of Buffalo. Quote, "They're afraid of a politician that can't be bought." Unquote. And that is Norman Solomon's piece. Since then, the Cleveland by Plain Dealer, which I believe is the largest mainstream newspaper in Ohio, certainly in Cleveland, has delivered a powerful endorsement, of Nina Turner. And they did it on the basis of Nina Turner's record in offices she has held and in activities she performed versus Shontel Brown's performance, which is, according to the Plain Dealer, very, very lacking. She has done little or nothing in the positions she has held, and little or nothing outside of those positions. She's been a good little girl for the establishment. Never ruffled any feathers. Now getting all kinds of money coming in, but I don't want to say Nina Turner's the underdog when it comes to money, because Nina has been successful in raising a fortune for this run. I think it's going to go real hard for Shontel Brown. In fact, I'm going to go out on a little bit of a limb and saying, I don't think there's any way Nina can lose. Shouldn't say that, though, because, of course, they may try to construct some fake smear, some fake scandal, and maybe the people will continue to believe it. But this is a pattern that they're using all over the country. They used it on in Massachusetts. In order to beat off the challenger to Richie Neal. And they've used it in California as well. They manufactured a scandal out of whole cloth in order to defeat the wonderful challenger to Nancy Pelosi. So, next, of course, sooner or later, I had to get to this. We have common dreams. Let me share the post. It's entitled, well, what is it entitled? It's a picture of Keith McCoy, a senior director in ExxonMobil's Washington, D.C. government affairs team, who was secretly recorded by Unearthed, Greenpeace UK's investigative journalism arm. This photo screenshot came from Unearthed via Channel 4 News. Quote, bombshell, unquote, secret footage of ExxonMobil lobbyists sparks calls for actions by Congress. This one's by Jessica Corbett, June 30th, 2021. While ExxonMobil's decades of sowing public doubt about climate science and the impact of fossil fuels have provoked various lawsuits, secretly recorded videos released Wednesday exposed how the company continues to fight against U.S. efforts to tackle the climate emergency. Published by Unearthed, Greenpeace UK's investigative journalism arm, and the British Channel 4 News. The footage of ExxonMobil, the lobbyists, sparked new calls for congressional action to hold the oil and gas giant accountable. The videos obtained by Unearthed reporters posing as recruitment consultants feature Keith McCoy, a senior director in the ExxonMobil Washington, D.C. government affairs team, and Dan Easley, who was a senior director for federal relations until he left the company for a clean technologies firm earlier this year. Quote, in the midst of a deadly heat wave, the Exxon tapes show how Exxon's climate lies have spanned from outright denial to puppeteering our government and economy, said by Lindsay Mayman, 350.org's U.S. communications manager. Quote, Exxon knew and lied about the climate crisis for decades, and our communities are bearing the costs. As the window for action quickly closes, this footage proves what we've known all along. Exxon continues to desperately block necessary climate action to skirt accountability. We demand Congress immediately investigate Exxon and fossil fuel companies' climate crimes and make polluters pay for their destruction. Ro Khanna said this tape only solidifies what we already knew. Fossil fuel companies have lied to the public, regulators, and Congress about their products' dangers for years. I plan to ask the CEOs of Exxon, Chevron, and other fossil fuel companies to testify before my environment subcommittee. We can no longer allow Exxon or any other companies to prevent our collective action on the climate crisis. So McCoy said on the Zoom call secretly recorded in May that ExxonMobil cast doubt on the scientific consensus about the climate crisis and targeted centrist lawmakers like Senator Joe Manchin. Quote, I talk to his office every week, unquote, the lobbyist claimed, to scale back President Joe Biden's infrastructure package. Quote, did we aggressively fight against some of the science? Yes. Did we hide our science? Absolutely not, unquote, he said. Quote, did we join some of these shadow groups to work against some of the early efforts? Yes, that's true. but there's nothing illegal about that. You know, we were looking out for our investments, we were looking out for our shareholders. Well, we can play this, I guess.
Last month, in a European capital, unearthed Greenpeace Investigations Unit is making the final preparations, wiring up with covert recording devices. On K Street, Washington, D.C., home of America's most powerful lobbyists, Keith McCoy, a key representative of the biggest oil company in America, is waiting for the call. The timing's vital. What may be America's greatest chance to combat the climate crisis is going through Congress right now. The video connection is set up. It's time to go to work.
Hi, good to see you. How are you?
Moments later, Mr. McCoy will become one of the first ever executives to claim that ExxonMobil has aggressively fought climate science using front organizations to maximize shareholder profit.
Did we aggressively fight against some of the science? Yes. Did we join some of these shadow groups to work against some of the early efforts? Yes, that's true. But there's nothing illegal about that. You know, we were looking out for our investments. We were looking out for our shareholders.
In response, Exxon said, "We've supported climate science for decades," and accused Greenpeace of waging a multi-decade campaign against them and the industry. Keith McCoy thinks he's being headhunted for a new job. In fact, of course, he's being covertly filmed. So tonight, a man boasting at a job interview, or a never-seen-before look at how big oil tries to manipulate big power, or both? First, the targets. Congressmen are fish. Exxon is the fisherman.
When you have an opportunity to talk to a member of Congress, you know, I liken it to fishing, right? You know, you have bait, you throw that bait out. You know, it's all these opportunities that you use, and to use the fishing analogy again, just to kind of reel them in, because they're a captive audience. They know they need you, and I need them.
Senators pressed to do Exxon's bidding behind closed doors.
You want to be able to go to the chief, and so the chief knows you, that you can go to the chief and say, look, we've got this issue. We need Congressman so-and-so to be able to introduce this bill. We need him to make a floor statement. We need him to send a letter. You name it. We've asked for everything.
So who are the fish?
I'm Joe Manchin. I approve this act because
The biggest catch, according to Mr. Coy, is the conservative Democrat Senator Joe Manchin, who famously shot President Obama's cap-and-trade climate bill.
and I'll take dead aim at the cap and trade bill.
Joe Manchin, I talk to his office every week. He is the kingmaker, and he's not shy about sort of staking his claim early and completely changing the debate.
Legal declarations show that Senator Manchin has received tens of thousands of dollars from ExxonMobil and its trade associations. Keith McCoy names 10 other senators as crucial to ExxonMobil. Senators Mark Kelly, Chris Coons, Shelley Moore Capito, Kirsten Sinema, John Tester, Maggie Hassan, John Barrasso, Steve Daines, John Cornyn, and Marco Rubio. All bar Kelly and Hassan have taken money from Exxon totaling $117,000. We gave all these senators a chance to respond. None did so. Exxon insists our lobbying efforts are fully compliant with all laws and are publicly disclosed.
Okay, so a very damaging leak. Okay, of course, I hope you noticed that all the Democratic senators that were named in that video also voted against the $15 an hour provision of the American Rescue Plan.
Why? They want more?
evidently the same people who were backing the oil companies, fossil fuel companies, and who were taking their money are also people who want to keep the minimum wage at $7.25. So that was, of course, a very frank video. I'm not going to play the whole thing for obvious reasons. But it's a pretty raw admission. Okay, it is making the news. Okay, it is going around. The senators are caught they're really red-handed with this. And I don't think Congress is going to do anything. They're going to wait for it to blow over because that is what they do. They're not going to give any interviews about it. They won't make any statements about it. They're just simply going to deny they did anything wrong. And if you believe that, then I got a bridge to sell you. It's all totally corrupt. We know it's corrupt. We knew it was corrupt before. This is just another confirmation. Okay, next. We have Sheer Intelligence. This is from Popular Resistance, which is edited by Margaret Flowers. But she's running a piece by Robert Sheer from SheerPost.com. Robert Sheer has been a progressive journalist since the 1960s. He's a grand old man by now. He did some of the original stories of dealing with skepticism about the establishment's view of the assassination of John Kennedy. He goes back that far. He is a great journalist, has always been a great journalist. And this piece is about Julian Assange. The public and personal urgency of Assange's case. The above is a photo of John Shipton, Julian's father. And I don't know who the others are in the photo. I don't think the other one, is Gabriel Shipton, but I've seen his face before, but the faces there don't look entirely familiar. But his brother might be in that picture too. I've only seen him one other time. So the saga of Julian Assange's persecution has been defined by leading human rights organizations as one of the most significant threats to press freedom, in our time. I think it may be the most significant threat to press freedom, because no courts are riding to the rescue in this case. No courts across the world are rising to the rescue. Everybody is bowing to the sheer power of the United States and its desire to make this guy pay for what apparently were completely legal acts to uncover severe wrongdoing by the military and the government of the United States. The WikiLeaks founder published, among other devastating leaks, the collateral damage video obtained by Chelsea Manning that revealed war crimes being committed in Iraq by U.S. soldiers as U.S. authorities attempted to extradite Assange for alleged violations of the Espionage Act. He took refuge for several years in the Ecuadorian embassy in the UK, until he was imprisoned in a high-security London facility in 2019. The WikiLeaks founder has since been kept in appalling conditions there. And although a British judge denied the U.S. extradition request due to concerns for Assange's health, were he to be sent to an American prison, the Biden administration is still appealing the decision. And the British judge is still keeping him in the high-security London facility. I don't know if he's still in Belmarsh at this point, but he's still in a high-security facility, and right now they've got nothing to hold him on. Scheer Intelligence host Robert Scheer has been a staunch defender of Julian Assange, noting the importance of the revelations he made, as well as the profoundly dangerous threat his imprisonment poses to news publishers, journalists, and news sources the world over. Scheer has done several interviews regarding the case, including with Tariq Ali, co-editor of the collection of essays in defense of Julian Assange. Niels Meltzer, the United Nations special rapporteur on torture, who defines Assange's treatment as torture, as well as Pentagon whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg, and most recently Pulitzer Prize winner Chris Hedges, who have both publicly defended Assange throughout his persecution. This week, Scheer is joined by John and Gabriel Shipton, Julian Assange's father and brother, as they toured the U.S. to raise awareness and support for Assange's release from prison. That was a while ago. And the date of this article was July 2nd, but they've been touring for a while now. Scheer has done several interviews regarding the case, including with Tariq Ali, co-editor of the collection of essays in defense of Julian Assange, Niels Meltzer, the UN's special rapporteur on torture, who defines Assange's treatment as torture, as well as Pentagon whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg, and most recently the Pulitzer Prize winner Chris Hedges, who have both publicly defended Assange throughout his persecution. This week, Scheer is joined by John and Gabriel Shipton, Assange's father and brother, as they tour the U.S. to raise awareness and support for Assange's release from prison. The poignant conversation between Assange's family and Scheer adds a deeply personal dimension to a case that is both privately devastating for the family as well as publicly devastating for freedom of the press. Speaking of the conditions in Belmarsh prison, where Assange essentially is being held in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, Gabriel tells Scheer about the last time he was able to see his brother. I saw Julian in October last year. It was during COVID, so we had only a 45-minute visit. We couldn't touch. Had no embracing. Julianne likes to have a hug, but we couldn't even do that. After that, the prison went into total lockdown, and he hadn't had any visits for 8 months until last week. He was able to see his kids again. John credits his son Julian with raising global awareness of the horrors of the horrors America was subjecting Iraqis to through the release of the collateral damage, quote-unquote, footage, arguing that Assange has played a critical role in scaling down the decades-long occupation of Iraq. Quote, now it's up to us to some way or other bring an end to his persecution and bring him home to his kids, unquote, Assange's father said to Scheer. Quote, he's done his job for us. It's now up to us to do our job, unquote. Which is, by the way, a job we haven't been doing for 10 years now. Listen to the full discussion as John and Gabriel Shipton talk to Scheer about Assange's hard-fought struggle to be freed and all that's at stake in his case. You can also read the transcript of this episode below the credits. Okay, I cannot play that, I think, without a violation, so I'm just going to read the transcript. Hi, this is Robert Scheer with another edition of Scheer Intelligence, where the intelligence comes from my guests. And I'm really excited we have John and Gabriel Shipton, respectively, the father and brother of Julian Assange. I'm sure anyone listening to this show knows that Assange is arguably one of the most famous political and certainly journalistic prisoners in the world. I've had a number of shows about that, but they're on a tour. And one reason I wanted to do this podcast is I don't see where this tour is getting as much publicity as I think it deserves and needs. And so let me begin with that. You have some sort of fancy name for the tour, but basically you started in Florida, Miami, and now you're going to be appearing in Los Angeles and will before I put this up. But what has been the response here? Robert, well, we started off in Miami and then worked our way up the East Coast, and then we did a little, that was Gabriel Shipton talking. And Robert Scheer says, by the way, identify yourself because, and Gabriel Shipton says, Gabriel Shipton here. And but Scheer says, yeah. And Gabriel Shipton says, Julian's brother. And Scheer says, yeah. Gabriel Shipton said, so we started off in Miami, then we did the East Coast, Washington, New York. Then we moved into, Midwest, Chicago, Columbus, Ohio. And we made our way to Minneapolis and St. Paul, and now we've made our way west. We were in Denver yesterday and the day before. And today we're in San Francisco, and then we'll continue on to LA and then end up in Washington for the finale. Robert Scheer says, so what's the response? I mean, the reason I'm asking is, well, there's this sort of outpouring of support that we see wherever we go. People coming out, people who've supported Julian for a long time. There are new supporters coming on, lots of anti-war groups, Everyone who sort of gets this case and what it really means for press freedoms and the First Amendment. Let me cut to the chase, because we live in a mass media society. And we have this odd situation where, for example, 24 press freedom civil liberties groups organized by the Freedom of the Press Foundation and ACLU, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Knight First Amendment Institute, the Committee to Protect Journalists, by Reporters Without Borders, an organization like PEN, have all signed on to say the Biden administration should stop pressing charges, withdraw these charges against Julian Assange. It's kept him in inhumane, according to the UN torture rapporteur Neil Smeltzer. I did a podcast with him, Inhumane Circumstances. Going to ask you about that, but I don't see the lift. I don't see much attention on that. No, you are out there doing your best. But are you getting mass media publicity? Does the New York Times cover it? Does anyone from television? And Gabriel Shipton says, well, since we've come, there's been maybe 30 articles now, and so Robert Scheer says, this is Gabriel. Please identify yourselves because, yeah. Gabriel says, there's been, 30 plus articles. People are talking about Julian's case again. We were on Democracy Now! We had a segment on Democracy Now! We had a segment on Tucker Carlson since, but we came here. So I think, we've been able to sort of, and Robert Scheer asks, is Tucker Carlson hostile or friendly? And Gabriel Shipton says, no, he's friendly. He sees he's a big First Amendment proponent. Amy Goodman and Tucker Carlson together on an issue is very rare. And Scheer says, yeah, that's interesting. How about the groups I mentioned, though? Are you getting support from the ACLU and Human Rights Watch and so forth? And Gabriel Shipton says, not as much as we would like. And she says, okay, well, what we have to know about That's what we have to know about. Look, it's been argued. It was argued by these organizations. This is a fundamental press freedom question, that the charges against Julian Assange could be leveled against the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, or any other publication, because what the basic charges said is if you print, publish, or print classified information, they're fair game, and you can grab them in whatever country they are, because after all, Julian Assange is not a U.S. citizen. He wasn't working here, and so forth. So it's a frontal assault on press freedom. Let me just put that out there. That's not to be really quibbled with, and yet I don't get the energy. Now, you know we're in post-Trump. We're supposed to be have a honeymoon with Biden. But the fact of the matter is, it's the Biden administration that's keeping John, you haven't said much yet, your son, and Gabriel, your brother, in prison. Why don't we first begin by talking about, you've been in that prison, you talked to him, describe the conditions there, then talk about the response of the Biden administration. John Shipman says, okay, a couple of things there. The circumstances that Julian's held in are aptly described exactingly by Niels Melzer, so and Robert Shea says, so that's the UN rapporteur. As I said, I did a podcast with him, so we have that description. People can look, but go on. You've been in there visiting him, right? John Shipman says, Niels Melzer, this is important. He's a professor at law at Glasgow University, and he's the UN rapporteur on torture. Did a 36-page report and a subsequent report. Okay. Both of them characterized what Julian was experiencing as a slow-motion murder before our eyes. So that's the circumstance. You can't alleviate, you can't quibble, you can't examine it and pull it apart till you get the details and say he's all right. Overall, what's been happening for the last 12 years, a slow-motion murder. The states that are involved would be comforted if that was successful, because there would be 3 more court cases examining in detail the participation of those states, the Swedish Prosecution Authority, the Crown Prosecution Service, and the Department of Justice of the United States, in that deliberate torture and murder of a journalist and publisher. So that's a mess for them, an effing mess, if you like. That's the circumstance. The next is that our concerns that we raise in our travels across the United States, Europe, and England, and Australia are generalized in 2 ways. 1, in the United States, it's overarching, an umbrella gathering underneath it all the people of the United States who are politically active or concerned under press freedom and the First Amendment. So naturally, it is vast but thin. So the pinpointed news items that your commentary expects can't happen because it doesn't gather up, for example, one party and push forward. One party, for example, a Democratic Party. It's overarching. As a consequence, like an umbrella, thin, but gathers all, it gathers all underneath it. That's the circumstance. And outside of the United States, the circumstances are that they are intensely concerned that this oppresses and intimidates publishers and publications worldwide, in the Western world, from any commentary on the United States. Well, not only the United States, but they'd say on the United States foreign policy. Any commentary will result in the oppression and intimidation of the journalist. In Julian's case, there are lawyers in 5 jurisdictions. There's about 100 lawyers involved. And the jurisdictions are the EU, the European Court of Human Rights, and the United Kingdom, Australia, Spain, and the United States. The overall expenses so far to date are probably around $10 million. As you know, it's pretty certain that that's a comprehensive understanding, that it's a worldwide resistance, thin but worldwide, resistance of the United States oppressing Europe and Australia, and the citizens of the United States oppressing them, intimidating and oppressing publications and journalists that are going to comment upon national security information, or actually anything that the Department of Justice and those that invigorate the Department of Justice in these directions, anything that they don't like. Okay, but now who is just speaking? But Gabriel, and John says, John. And the Shear says, John, okay, you guys have got to, because we're going to run a transcript with this, and it'll be a nightmare for Lucy Burbio, our transcriber, if we don't do this, so please give me the name. So, John, I read an interview that you did 2 years ago with an Australian journalist, and you described going in. You said that Julian only had 2 hours of outside visitors other than with lawyers. Okay, you described the condition. Has that changed? Have you seen him but more recently than that? Just bring us up to date on what it's like for him and what are the circumstances. Well, the circumstances have worsened. Now, the circumstances for all the prisoners in that jail, they are this, that it's in complete lockdown because there's an infestation of COVID-19 in the staff and in the prisoners. It means that the prisoners die. A prisoner alongside Julian's cell died. It means also this, when the staff gets sick, the reduction of facilities and supervision that the staff go about happens to the prisoners. So consequently, they're locked up 23 hours a day and they get a telephone which they can ring up and have a chat for a maximum amount of time, 10 minutes. They get 20 minutes with their lawyers. That's the circumstances. So they have gradually worsened over the years. Julian managed to get a visit, first time since October, from his family, the other day the children. So as he was able to embrace his son for the first time in 6 months. That circumstances apply to all the prisoners. However, Julian Assange is innocent, and his extradition has been refused, and yet he's still in jail. She says, yeah, and just to bring listeners up to it, the extradition was refused by the British judge on the grounds that it would endanger, that conditions in an American jail would endanger Julian's well-being in life, actually. But the judge inexplicably accepted the legitimacy of the U.S. government reaching into England, grabbing someone who had embarrassed the U.S. government, denying any relevance of press freedom, intellectual freedom, or anything else, accountability. And so that was a mixed decision. But nonetheless, where are we legally right now? What is Julian looking at? Is there any hope? Is there any point of clarity? John Shipton says, no, there's not. The Crown Prosecution Service wrote to the Australian government, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, saying that would be about 2 months from April 7th. Well, the 2 months is well and truly over, and they haven't made a decision on whether an appeal can go ahead. That decision and that application is made before a high court judge. One high court judge decides on that. Once that decision is made, if an appeal is allowed, then that's heard before the high court. However, what we wait upon is a decision as to whether an appeal by the United States can or cannot go ahead. So Robert Shear says, I see, so we're just waiting for that decision. But meanwhile, Julian, as you described in that interview anyway, he's basically been held under a condition of solitary confinement. John Shipton says, exactly. The Istanbul Protocol says that 23 hours a day in your cell is solitary confinement. Julian is in a cell about 23 hours a day, but he gets a telephone. John is his father. When is the last time you actually could visit him? John Shipton says, last time I haven't. It was March last year, but Gabriel, who's alongside me, has visited and can give you a report on the circumstances. So Robert says, Gabriel, go ahead. Gabriel says, okay, I saw Julian in October of last year. It was during COVID, so the visits were cut very much shorter. We had only a 45-minute visit. We couldn't touch, no embracing. So, there was a sort of awkward moment at the end of the visit where we just sort of look at each other. And usually Julian likes to have a hug, but, we couldn't even do that. And after that, he didn't have any visits. The prison went into total lockdown. Hadn't had any visits for 8 months, but last week he was able to see his kids again, as John said. Robert Shear says, well, how are, I know this is really difficult. This is a son and a brother. And it's difficult just to think about the international press freedom characterizations. But what I don't get, you talk about the support he's getting. I realize there is significant support. I don't know why there isn't overwhelming support. I don't understand, because this, John, you have mentioned it in a number of interviews. He didn't commit any crimes, or any crimes that the New York Times doesn't routinely commit. when they feel a classified piece of information is relevant to their readers and has been withheld from them by their government. Certainly the Pentagon Papers and Daniel Ellsberg has spoken out eloquently in support of Julian Assange. That has been a bedrock of press freedom fights throughout the world. Just because the government declares something classified, for instance, the shooting of civilians, including journalists, one of the revelations of WikiLeaks, but many others of chicanery by government, of crimes, war crimes by government, obviously you're going to break classification in any country. And I want to sort of circle back before we run out of time to why this tour of yours is not getting my attention, but getting more attention. I realize you're doing your best. I'm going to go to a meeting in a couple of days where you're speaking. Call all my friends and tell them they should go. But I do not understand why you're not getting more support from traditional media. Because if Julian Assange loses this case, press freedom has had what may be an irreversible blow. John Shipton says, I agree with you. The irreversible blow has already happened. The circumstances of 12 years. This is John now, right? John Shipton says, yes. Scheer says, I don't want to attribute statements to one and not the other. I realize you're separate people, so just work with me on that, John. Go ahead. This is John here. The circumstances that you speculate on have already arrived. I'll just go through it again. Nobody, no journalist, no publisher wants to take on the Department of Justice and have their journalist be arbitrarily detained for 12 years while they fight court cases in 5 jurisdictions and have to raise $10 million so far. That must be clear to everybody. It's already there. The only way it can be alleviated is for journalists and publishers to rise up and say, no, we don't want this. But the circumstances in the United States of 6 corporations, all dependent on government warrants of one sort or another, for example, bandwidth regulation, for example, distribution, for example, agreements with unions for transportation, for example, warrants to be able to import their newsprint and so on, access to the internet. They all depend upon a government warrant. Now, as a consequence, they become cowardly and have become cowardly. So that's the circumstance within the United States, equally applying to those in Australia and the UK. Another circumstance is this, that the Freedom of Information is revealed at the CIA at 400 people in the United States in significant positions in news corporations and news outlets. That's another thing to take into account. The thing is managed. However, because circumstances are so replete with constitutional difficulties, which is too weak a word, and she says contradictions, violations of the, and John Shipton says violations of the First Amendment, violations of the Bill of Rights, 2 glorious attributions to the Constitution of the United States being destroyed. This is the circumstance that the corporations who are to an extent cowardly can use to gather up popular and political support to move against. That's the circumstances. Well, tell me about the human part here, because the major attack on Julian, it's very difficult to attack him for what he published, because major newspapers and electronic outfits, television, and what have you, used his information. So the newsworthiness of what WikiLeaks revealed is not in question. So what has happened is actually a campaign of character assassination, beginning with the Swedish government's charges, which later were dropped. There's a constant personal attack on Julian Assange. And by the way, people forget that happened against Daniel Ellsberg as well in the Pentagon case. Now people tend to forget that, but his character was assassinated. So just talk about Julian Assange as a human being. You're the father and Gabriel's the brother. Let's talk about this, because just sitting there, I'll tell you my own feeling. I think this is one of the great heroes of journalism. I'm a journalist. I've done it all my life. I'm amazed at how much important information Julian was able to gather and reveal. No one can doubt the significance of that information and its importance to a functioning democracy. Okay. We're not talking about finding out what movie star is sleeping with someone or anything else. This is not petty. This is not gossipy. This is the guts of how power works, government power. So what they've done is, instead of examining the charges of really what he revealed, there has just been a constant assault on his character. You know his character better than anyone, the two of you as well as anyone, John Shipton says. But just to give you one example, and this is John again. John here. One example of Julian's humanity is when the collateral video was allegedly given to Julian, in WikiLeaks. Describe what that, for those who don't know, what that revealed also. The collateral murder video revealed the slaughter of 11 human beings in Baghdad by an Apache helicopter and the murder of 2 good Samaritans who were passing by with their children, taking them to school, and attempted to put one of the wounded men, a cameraman, a Reuters journalist, into their car to take them away, and consequently they were murdered and their children in the front seat were badly wounded. An American soldier gathered up his courage and his humanity and grabbed one of the bleeding children and held the child to his breast and ran to take the child to hospital. So there's always, it's not completely, it's not a complete horror accusation against American soldiers. So that's the circumstance. When they received the video, they wished to put names on the dead because it's really important for human beings to give the rituals of death. So Kristen Hafrenson, I think that's the way you pronounce it, Hafrenson, went to Baghdad. The city at that time was a revolutionary hotbed, took his life in his hands, and interviewed as many people as he could, in particular the relatives of the men who were murdered taking their children to school and the relatives of the journalists. They couldn't find the names of the other 11 people who were slaughtered on that day, but they managed to give names to the other 3. The 2 journalists and the man who was taking his kids to school. So that's the quality of humanity that exists in Julian's heart. Yeah. And Scheer says, okay, so what about the character assassination? I mean, this is where you're a witness, father and brother are critical. And John Shipton said, I for myself, Gabriel can answer for himself, but I take no notice whatsoever of this sort of thing. I know Julian. I know what he's like. I know his capacities. And I know the love's in his heart. So all of those insults and smears and mobbing, I just don't take any notice of them. They don't even enter. They don't rise above the horizon of my radar. Gabriel, yeah, I'm the same as John, and I can easily recognize the reputational attacks and what they're used to do. They used to malign Julian to make him easier to prosecute under the Espionage Act. So it's very easy to recognize those attacks and their purpose. Yeah, again, I mentioned Daniel Ellsberg this year, who I know quite well, and I covered his trial during the Nixon years. People forget now, and it really is commendable that Daniel Ellsberg has played a major role in defending Julian Assange, drawing a comparison with what they revealed. But first of all, it shouldn't matter what the character is of the person who revealed it. What should matter is the information important. Is it newsworthy? Is it something the public needs? I think the character stuff is brought up precisely because it's very difficult to make an argument that in a functioning democracy, we didn't need to know that our government was killing civilians, and including journalists, as one of the stories. So I think it becomes a refuge for scoundrels in a way. But you don't want to argue the merits of the case, so you go for smears. Don't we just see this all the time? Every time two people disagree and one person is clearly in the right, it often is the case that the other person goes on video and does whatever they can to smear the other person because they have no case on the merits. But it seems to be working, and I don't know. I'm doing this out of some desperation because I don't think we're paying enough attention. I've talked to people who listen to this show. I don't know why this is not getting more attention. And when I heard you folks are on tour, I thought, okay, let's do a podcast about it so we get your perspective on it. But I do not understand why. Well, I guess I do understand. But it's a shameful moment for the media that certainly exploited the stories that WikiLeaks revealed, including the attacks on the Democratic Party for hurting Bernie Sanders' chance. We go through the whole thing here. But the idea that the media has not responded with the vigor that it did during the Pentagon Papers case against Daniel Ellsberg, that is alarming. Do you want to add anything to that before we wrap up? Yeah. So there's really something really important here and vital to, and who is this? Is John? Yes, John. And the vital to our understanding of this phenomenon is that's 10 years ago now that the Iraq war files, Guantanamo files, and Afghan war logs were revealed. Okay, 10 years have passed. An organization as rich and as gigantic as the United States of America takes a long time to turn around. Over the years, the enculturation of the revelations that Chelsea Manning allegedly made and were published by WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, among others, those revelations have encultured. And the result is that the Afghan war is over, the troops are being removed. The Iraq war is over, the troops are being removed. They're attempting to end the Syrian war and remove the last of 2,000 troops that are there. The Guantanamo Bay is in the process of being closed. So this gives us an understanding of the pattern of enculturation of this news. So the results are there for all of us. In an immediate sense, the cables revealed to us in 2006, there was a group of soldiers outside Baghdad who attacked the house and murdered the entire family therein. These soldiers, contemplating their crime, called in an aircraft strike and destroyed from the earth the evidence of that family in that house. This was revealed in a cable from the U.S. ambassador in Baghdad to the Department of Justice. Upon seeing that cable and the publicity surrounding it, the Iraqi government gathered up its courage and refused to sign the Status of Forces Agreement, as a consequence of which the United States and its allies, my country included, had to remove their forces from Iraq. These are extraordinary phenomena and will give you insight into the reasons why certain sections of the United States remain disgruntled and continue to pursue Julian. The results are there. The wars are finished. The troops are removed, and it's become encultured in the societies in the West and in the United States. This government action, unsupervised by democracy and participation of the people, of the polity, that's a great thing. So never discount it in concerning ourselves with the murderous oppression of Julian. It worked. It worked. So all praise to Julian. Given that, it's up to us to some way or other together bring an end to his persecution and bring him home to his kids. He's done his job for us. It's now up to us to do our job. And that's John speaking, right? Yes, and John, the father of Julian Assange. But I think what you said is quite powerful, and that could be said of Daniel Ellsberg when he was a whistleblower. And Daniel, as we pointed out, he thought there'd be a lot of whistleblowers after what he did, reading the Pentagon Papers, knowing that the whole basis of the war in Vietnam was a tissue of lies, that the government knew it, and so forth. It took a long time, though, it took 5 years more for the war to end. But nonetheless, Daniel Ellsberg said he expected there'd be lots of whistleblowers. The fact is, we've had very few. And the fact is that Julian Assange is, one of a handful. And all of them, Edward Snowden is living king in exile. Every one of them has been punished. They lost their jobs. Some were thrown in jail, they lost everything. their pensions. They were humiliated. So I want to take your point, but really talk about the quality of democracy and sort of the notion of American innocence, because it is true. Finally, the truth came out, but lots of people died, lots of damage, lots of suffering. And I think the reason why the Julian Assange case is so important is that if we don't reward whistleblowers, truth seekers, people who have the courage to do what Julian has done, and and you described his life, what has happened, I mean, it is torture. If we don't make these people heroes, if we don't acknowledge it, where will the future whistleblowers and truth seekers come from? We've had them before. Tom Paine was such a person. But a mob tore up the cemetery and scatters his bones to the countryside. He was not honored often in his own time. And I think, yes, you're absolutely right. The revelations of WikiLeaks and others, but mostly WikiLeaks, has actually made these wars an embarrassment, and they are being brought to an end. That doesn't mean we're not going to have future wars, and that those future wars most people will go along with them who are participating. The question really about Julian Assange, and maybe this sounds like an editorial, is not why did he do that, or the revelations of Chelsea Manning, really, who was in the system and revealed it, but why the thousands of people who knew these things were happening did not speak up. And you can't have a functioning democracy if you do not reward the people who speak up. So would you accept that as sort of a caveat to your tribute to the success so far? John Shipman says, yes, I would. It's John here. Yes, I would, Robert. I think that is an important understanding. But I don't expect Julian to be, pedestalized, placed on a pedestal. I just expect that the people of the United States acknowledge the gifts that Chelsea Manning and Julian have made and ensure that he gets home to his kids. That's all. My expectations are moderate and human and part of a father's responsibility. That's all. And Robert Shear says, well put, but let me close by asking, about Chelsea Manning, because it seems to me here the government strategy was to get Chelsea to turn on Julian Assange and say, oh yes, he helped me break the code and he was responsible and so forth. And Chelsea Manning is one of the great heroes, one of the really great heroes of American history for not doing that, for refusing to go along, and has suffered enormously. Maybe we should close this by evaluating Chelsea Manning's role in this, because after all, that was the source of some of the most important, truthful stories that Julian Assange published. John Shipman says, well, I think Chelsea Manning, just for a parallel or a metaphor, if you like, is equivalent to Joan of Arc, by Jeanne d'Arc in France. So she stands head and shoulders above the populace of the United States as an example of what can be produced by this community. A fine example to all of courage, of resilience, and also integrity. So that is my expectation, that over time, that will be her position in the pantheon of gods of the United States. And Gabriel, do you want to add to that? She's a hero, She brought all this change to U.S. foreign policy. She's bettered by U.S. society. U.S. society is better off before the revelations she made. I think she should be held up as a hero to everyone, as someone who can follow in their footsteps, I think. Robert Chia says a hero because she didn't take the deal, She was, they did commute her sentence, You play ball with us. Let's get this guy, Julian Assange. You'll be scot-free. We'll even celebrate you. And she said no. Yeah, and in her original act, she saw something that she didn't agree with. And, she thought the world needed to know. So she stood up. And I hope we can all do that one day. Okay, and Robert Chia says, all right. Well, that was John just now, right? And Gabriel says, Gabriel. Oh, Gabriel, I don't know what I'm going to do. Have to get the transcript and you guys check it out. But, I do think I've read a number of your talks, okay, that you guys have given. I think this tour is important. Where does it go after when this publishes on Friday and is up on KCRW and so forth? Are you still going to be around speaking? Are there places people can hear you? So we're going to be in Washington, D.C. on the 30th. That will be our final date where we're doing something in the First Amendment room at the National Press Club with Cornel West, which is a National Press Club, is where Julian first brought the Collateral Murder video to us. So it has a great significance. So they can catch us there. Yeah, that will be it for this tour. And hopefully we don't have to come back and Julian can be freed. She says, well, I want to thank you. This is John and Gabriel Shipton, the father, John and Gabriel, the brother of Julian Assange. And I think it's so terrific to have you out there making the case. Obviously, you're well informed. You have visited with Julian, but you're providing an element of humanity here. And the worst thing about smear attacks and, ad hominem attacks and so forth is when you have truly heroic people, you can always, undermine them because you don't want real heroes. You don't want people to tell the truth. It's embarrassing to the people who remain silent. That's really what it's all about, and they can do it if Julian Assange could speak up and suffer the way he has been, whether it was in the embassy or now in solitary confinement, and do that. Chelsea Manning could stick to her integrity and not betray Julian Assange, then why don't others do that? And then the easiest thing, and this includes, unfortunately, some journalists as well, you just denigrate the whistleblower. That's my own little editorial here. I find it appalling that this case is not getting more support than it has. I would really encourage people to get involved and look at it. And the key thing is really, what is the crime here? John, when he was interviewed in a couple of the interviews, makes that point. What really is the crime of Julian Assange? Is it that he told the truth? Does anyone doubt? No one has said these cables were played with, were distorted, made up, or poorly transcribed. No one has denied that this was information that people in a free society should have. And yet the fellow who gave it to us, the two people who gave it to us, Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange, have suffered enormously. That's it for this edition of Sheer Intelligence. I want to thank our guests, John and Gabriel Shipman, for sharing this time with us. Christopher Ho, who posts these programs on KCRW. Joshua Shear, who is the executive producer of Sheer Intelligence. Also, Natasha Hakimi Zapata, who writes the introduction, Lucy Burbio, who does the transcription. And I want to thank the JWK Foundation in the memory of a great journalist, Gene Stein, for helping support these programs. See you next week with another edition of Sheer Intelligence. Gabriel Shipton and John Shipton say thank you, Robert. And that's the end. I thought that was very moving and very wonderful. And also, it really brought up terrible, I think the terrible reaction to this whole case and the terrible lack of interest and the terrible behavior of the Swedish government and the UK government, okay, and our government, and the terrible behavior of the international community in not calling these governments to heel for the violations of press freedom we have seen here. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the freedom of the press, and our religious freedoms. They are the most important freedoms that we have, that our whole system, okay, is based upon. We live in a time today when freedom of speech and freedom of assembly routine violated by police in communities across the country. They routinely violated. There's no accountability. There are no penalties. They just do it as a strategy to shut down our exercise of freedoms of speech. And of course, the government is shutting down the press and putting the fear of God into the press so that it can only say things which do not displease the government. So this is horrible. We have been in a long, long process of losing our democracy. I talked about that also last night with respect to voter suppression, and gerrymandering, and trying to rig elections. But this is all part of the pattern. The powers that be, the establishment, are fighting on every front to destroy our democracy. And we have to find a way to stand up and stop it. We have to find the courage to stop it. I don't think any less than general strikes in the street are going to stop this and make the government begin to behave like a government that cares about justice and that cares about our rights again. I say again because I think I've lived through times when our government did care about those kinds of things, at least to some degree. But I've never lived through a period like this where there's such a systematic attempt to destroy our freedoms and our democracy. So that's it for tonight. I will be taking your comments now, as I always do. Greg Mallard says, I wonder what the percent of the people in the UK have been vaccinated. I don't know offhand. Ghostart says, I'm still getting error. I guess there was error, okay, on YouTube. If you can't watch this, okay, on YouTube, well, I see. T says, I don't trust the long-term effects of COVID. I want no part of it. Jen on status quo as long haulers. I know she does. And she's still suffering from it. Even now, when she goes out into the field, she's still suffering from it. Ghostart says, I'm good now. Went to his page and started up. To my page, I guess that is Ghostart, right? Evelina says, Delta now, the dominant variant. Apparently it's highly contagious. Yeah, it's 2 or 3 times more contagious than the Alpha variant was. It is infecting people in all the provinces in Cuba. In Argentina, it's practically closed its borders, allowing only 600 people a day in. I'm surprised that Cuba, okay, is allowing people in. But I think the Cubans are probably more well-equipped to deal with it. But we'll have to wait and see how bad it is for them. Generally speaking, they've done a good job, okay, of handling COVID, but far better than we have. They're not among the best of the world, though, in spite of their fine National Health Service system. Joe Logan says, it's not COVID, it's really colds, flu, and also pneumonia. Even he says, except it is in flu season. And Kay says, the U.S. has many anti-vaxxers too. Evelina says, the Bojo is a clown. And Ghost Star says, extreme heat temperatures rising up to 40 degrees Celsius in Vancouver, Canada had caused sea animals like mussels, clams, and snails to cook to their death. Ghost Star says, feed keeps dropping. I don't know what's wrong with it tonight. Must be storms or something. I think I'm using my regular software. I'm not doing anything special. I'm not having any noticeable problem myself, okay, on this end. Greg says Boris Johnson is a wanker. Yeah. Steve Wolfbrand said the ancient Romans would have a jubilee when the emperor changed, whereupon all debts were canceled. They also periodically canceled all debts, okay, in Babylonia too. I think in Babylonia they did it every 7 years. Greg said, here comes the rain. Okay, says, be careful there, Greg Mallard. Greg says, Elsa is weakening as it moves closer. It should be out by 2 a.m. according to new reports. He says, of course, cancellation of student debt is progressive. Rich people don't incur debt if possible. And Teresa Santa says, hey, Greg O.T. Greg O.T. or Gregory? And Kay says, might flood. Steve Wolfbrand says, doesn't sound too bad, luckily. Greg says, thankfully, according to new developments, there's no threat of severe weather in this. It's most likely a tropical depression by now. That is good news. Steve says, here in California, we can only wish for that rain. The drought is very severe. Alana says, the feed seems okay now. Steve says, socialist mayor won in Buffalo. Alana says, very sad about the heat victims. Me too. Steve says, we do the work. Kashama should be next, says Steve. Is she going to run for Congress? I hope she runs for Congress. Steve Wolfbrand says, fuck them. And Greg Mallard says, new weather radar shows Elsa breaking up quickly as she moves north. Ghost says, it's not just Joe's stream dropping. A2, YouTube. Evelyn says, thing with Elsa is that it's the earliest hurricane of the season in history. Oh, gee, I didn't realize that, but it is. It's July 7th. There are no hurricanes by July 7th. Kay says, big pharma Dems are trying to sink Nina in Cleveland too. Ghostot says, Ed Markey endorsed Nina. Yep, he did. Steve Wolfbrand says, fuck Clyburn, we need Nina Turner. Yeah, it's what's going on in Cleveland is it's the Sanders wing, okay, of the Democratic Party against the establishment wing, okay, of the establishment wing of the Democratic Party. Kay says, listen to a couple live streams from Nina and others today. Hope she wins. I think she's going to run away with it. Kay says, the BD sucks too. Steve says, if you watch Convo Catch video from today, they gave me a nice shout out at the very end. It was lovely. They're nice people. They are nice people. There's no question about it. They are great people. Amber says, I'm super late. Good evening, my lovelies. And Steve says, good evening, lovely. But lovey, he says. Good evening, Amber. Carmen says, I'm super duper late too. My apologies. Hey, Carmen, great to see you. Steve Wolfbrand says, yeah, Nina's got this one, Doc. I think she does. Kay says, we need to get money out of politics. Article 3, Section 2. As I said last night, Ghost Start says, remember to guard your privacy and abide by community guidelines. Kay says, if you could get money out of most GOP and many corporate Dems would be gone. Kay says, Roe is great. Amber says, CEOs get pulled in front of Congress all the time. Why is it that the fossil fuel industry is exempt all that dirty blood money from raping Mother Earth? And Ghostart says, Bryant's? Was that supposed to be Beyonce? I don't know. Carmen Muniz says Manchin and Sinema both to meet people like Jimmy and Steph. I just seem to have my stream just sort of stutter for a minute. That's the first time I've seen that today. Steve says, one nice thing about living in LA is occasionally having an opportunity to meet people like Jimmy and Steph and Pasta and Fee in person. I think I can say now that Fee and Pasta are personal friends. Such lovely people. Kay says, fracking has ruined everything that used to be good about Ohio. Evelyn says, those people are no patriots. They care nothing for the Nilo of their constituents. Oh, you're talking about Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, right? Steve Wolfbrand says, but Robert Scheer is a hero of my mind. I met him at Occupy LA. Evelyn says, to think he was invited to England by The Guardian, who published his material benefiting from it. And now they don't want to have anything to do with him. It's terrible. It's just terrible. Steve Wolfman says he's retired, but Robert Scheer is retired. Haven't seen anything from him in the longest time. The best LA Times employee ever. He was the editor-in-chief of Truthdig for a very, very long time. And then the publisher, of Truthdig, had all the money, wanted to make some changes. And so he fired Robert, and then most of the staff went out on strike. And so he fired the whole staff and he did something else. But also Chris Hedges was there, and he was one of those who went out on strike as well. Okay, so but Robert Scheer has something new that he started. I think it's called, it's right at the end of the article, that I linked to. I think it's called Scheer Times or something like that. But he's been doing that constantly since Truthdig ended. So he's been around. It's just that you have to know where, and you have to look for him. Carmen Muniz says, tears for Julian. Is this the original Robert or his son? This is the original Robert Scheer. Absolutely. This is not his son. His son is the executive producer of that show. But the person doing the interviewing was the original Robert Scheer. He's got to be in his 80s. Got to be in his 80s, because I think he's about the same age as Bonnie, and I. He might even be a little older. Steve says they did get a little bit of MSM coverage. Well, that's good. Ghostart says Australian parliamentarians were calling on the government of the United States to drop the unprecedented Espionage Act charges against #Julian Assange. How many Australian parliamentarians are calling for that? It really has to be the government of Australia that has to call for that. And really, there should be a no confidence vote in the Australian Parliament over this. And the Prime Minister should be dismissed for playing along with the United States on this. Kay says the U.S. is still doing war crimes all over the world. Yeah, all through Latin America. All through Latin America, war crimes. War crimes in Africa. Now war crimes in the Middle East. This is why journalists are going foreign to her staff, published, and their audience is going with them. to get stuff published, and their audience is going with them. Yes, the main witness has admitted to lying. Release Julian now. The case has fallen apart. FFS. Evelina says Assange's kids are adorable. Gostot says the U.S. plan to persecute Assange was decided back in 2011. Stratfor in Texas was involved. Steve Wolfbrand says Robert Scheer is the man. And Teresa says, thanks, Mr. Wizard. Time for this one to go to bed. Long day getting ready for company. Viva la revolucion. Thank you, Teresa, for coming. Good to see you here. Evelina says, Dr. Joe, did you hear Assange was diagnosed as being on the spectrum? No, I did not hear about that, but I think a lot of people are on the autism spectrum. It's a very broad spectrum. I think there are a lot of people who you wouldn't think are on the spectrum who are on the spectrum. So I'm not surprised that he was diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum. Evelina says, highly functioning, needless to say. Kay says, there are many who are. Evelina says, yep. Evelina says, just makes his incarceration all the more poignant and unjust. Evelina says, cruel. Steve Wolfbrand says, but Elon is autistic as well. Some are genius. Yeah, Julian is a genius himself. Evelina says, the young Greta is pretty special too. Special. Okay. Yes, it is a special in Spanish, isn't it? Steve says, yep. And Case says, love Greta. And Ghostart says, the U.S. policy always shoots the messenger. But Evelina says, baloney, they're moving forces out of Syria, okay, and Iraq. Simply not true, says Evelina. Yeah, I don't think that's true either. T says, Lauren Stein is a personal friend. Got to meet Glory and Steve from Slow News Day on Saturday. But these feuds are killing us. We are lost at the moment. Yep. There are terrible conflicts in the progressive sphere right now. But people, just attacking each other and forgetting that they are together on 98%, okay, of all the issues. And Carmen says, Rebecca Jones, COVID, the whistleblower from Florida, is running for Gates's seat. Certainly hope she gets it. Don't forget about John Kiriakou, the only person to go to jail, okay, for revealing our torture programs. Yep. I won't forget about him. But also Jeffrey Sterling was another whistleblower who went to jail as well. He was with the CIA and spent a few years getting persecuted, okay, in jail. Kay says, MS News is killing us. Shake my head. And Kay says, the USA is so corrupt in so many ways. Shake my head. Can Biden rise to the occasion and pardon Assange? It takes greatness. I don't think it takes greatness. I think it just takes a little bit of elementary decency for Biden to understand the family end of this, and for Biden to understand that what Julian was doing was telling the truth, and that's what we need to have in a democracy. He did a wonderful thing for this country. And it's absolutely a crime for Biden to continue to punish him. So it takes a little decency from Biden. It doesn't take any greatness. He's the president of the United States, goddammit. All he needs, okay, is a little decency. Why hasn't he forgiven student loan debt by now? Why hasn't he used Section 1881 of the Social Security Act? Sorry, 1881A, okay, of the Social Security Act, in order to give everybody free Medicare. We're still in the middle of the pandemic, of the COVID pandemic. Everybody needs free Medicare right now in the United States. A decent man would exercise Section 1881A and provide free Medicare. People have often said that Biden is a decent man. I am sorry, but I disagree. I disagree. His performance so far in the presidency is not the performance of a decent man. It is the performance of someone who cannot learn. It is the performance, okay, of someone who will not do the decent thing because he's too immersed in talking to cronies of his in the Congress. Kay says, I doubt it. But Evelina Pont, Steve Wolfbrand says, nope. Biden is leaving Cuba on the terror watch list. How stupid is that? Nearing the end, so before I go, I want to make a big announcement. Tomorrow at 9 p.m., I will be having a conversation with 2020 presidential candidate, an earlier presidential candidate of the Green Party, Howie Hawkins. He will be here with me at 9 p.m. tomorrow. So please come. It's going to be a very interesting conversation. Okay, it's not going to be the normal conversation on things like, I'm not going to ask him much about the campaign. Okay, I'm not going to talk about his platform, okay, unless he brings it up. We're just going to talk person to person about what we think is going on in the United States today and our take on that. And we're just going to exchange views on our take on what the State of the Union is in the United States right now. So Biden gave his State of the Union. Tomorrow, Howie Hawkins and I are going to give our views on the State of the Union. So come for that. It's going to be great. Okay, says Biden is leaving Cuba on the terror watch list. How stupid is that? It's not stupid. It's evil. It means sanctions, continued sanctions for Cuba. It's evil. It's not stupid. Carmen says, does anyone know if the Haitian president that was killed in his home was a good or a malevolent president? Haven't been paying attention to Haiti. I don't know. Amber says, it's too bad the deep state got to Trump because he would have pardoned Assange just to spite establishment Dems. And that is too bad. Steve says, I agree, Doc. We have to stop this shit now. Carmen says, we must hurry with the general strike. Florida has outlawed protesting. What we need to do is to outlaw Ron DeSantis. Carmen says, RSV is a horrible contagion in Florida now. It's almost like whooping cough. And Amber says, Lana posted this frightening video today about the wet bulbs where the humanity is so high that temps above 80 become deadly. as the body cannot cool itself. But that happens when the humidity is 95%, okay, or above. So if that happens and the temperature is high, you got to stay indoors. And Amber says, I guess that's what many died from in Canada recently, and it's happening more frequently. And I know that if it happened, okay, to British Columbia, it could just as easily have happened to Washington, okay, to Oregon, and to parts of California. Steve Borkbrand says, good night, sweet dreams. Good night, Steve. Kay says, Facebook has been crappy for me for quite a while. And, Ghost Start says, Biance bought science. Yeah. And Carmen Muna says, Garland Nixon would be a good progressive to ask about the ACLU stance, okay, on Julia. Ghost Start says Robert Scheer, born April 4th, 1936. Robert Scheer is 85. 85.
What's 85?
That's the age of Robert Scheer, who was just doing the interview of the Shiptons. And Carmen Mina says, unfortunately, Biden is for HRC and Julian exposed HRC. Somehow, Carmen, I don't think Biden is in love with HRC. There was tension between them, not just in terms of when they were running for president, but within the administration. I think HRC was one of those who looked down on Biden because his degree was from Syracuse University and not from one of the Ivy League schools. Carmen says, those COVID hospital bills are destroying families. I'm sure. And Kay says, Biden is no more decent than he has to be. And I kind of think that's true. Steve Wolfbrand says, sleepy time. Amber says, Garland Nixon, what do you think? I don't know what to think about Garland Nixon. Ask about the ACLU stance, okay, on Julian. And maybe he would be a good one to ask about that. And Ghostart says, I'm no longer one of the Steves, but tetralogy. Yeah, because you're Ghostart now, right? Lana says, good, I like Howie. We need to share the announcement. Please put the announcement up ASAP. Okay, I'll try to get it up, but after midnight tonight, so you can begin to share it. Amber says, I'd much rather watch you and Howie for the State of the Nation. I would bet the ratings for Biden would be super low. Thanks, Amber. Steve Wolfbrand says, Haitian president was not good. I kind of thought that. After all, he was backed by the United States. How could he be good? Carmen says, the humidity was 93% in Florida yesterday. Thank the universe that the wind was blowing. That sounds real bad. Steve Wolfman says, on the other hand, assassins are not good. Oh, there's Garland Nixon, who says, Amber H.K. Grigo, press releases, ACLU statement, UN panel finding. Oh, that's great. Thank you, Garland. And Carmen says, he has to cover for HRC because of his allegiance to DNC. He doesn't need the DNC anymore. The DNC needs him. Garland says Amber H.K. Grigo and leaves another link. ACLU comment on Julian Assange indictment. Okay, thank you, Garland. Well, I've come to the end. And even though I think Bonnie liked this stream a lot, I know she's going to tell me that.
I want everybody to tell us what they think of their democracy.
Oh, Bonnie says she wants everybody to tell us what they think of their democracy. So if you can spare the time and you leave some comments at either Facebook, okay, or YouTube, we will certainly pick up on them. I should warn you, though, if you leave comments on YouTube, don't leave the comments on the top chat, because the top chat doesn't survive. You have to go all the way to the bottom of the page and leave the public comments. And Dolores says, thank you and good night all. And Steve Wolfbrand says Garland is pretty cool. Ghost Art says, reportedly the Haitians were cheering their president's death. Oh, wow. And Kay says, thank you for another great discussion. I love you all. We love you, Kay. Carmen says, thank you, Joe. Got a me, oh my, oh night, night. And Steve Wolfbrand says, democracy, none here. Steve Wolfbrand is right. Evelina says, on a scale of 1 to 10, it's a 2. Thank you, Evelina. Well done. Carmen says, what democracy? And Lana says, good night. Kay says, I think our democracy sucks, Bonnie. Laugh out loud. Amber says, good night, everyone. Thank you, Joe and Bonnie. Thank you, Amber. Everybody take care. I'll be back tomorrow night with Howie. As long as the creeks don't rise, you understand. Everything anyone says, it's always contingent on the creeks not rising. That's what people from Ohio say. As long as the creeks don't rise. Good night, everybody. Have a great night.